Today, I will be providing an overview of the emerging Texas Risk and Authorization Management Program, aka TxRAMP. And as I stated at the beginning of this session, we're at capacity for our platform, so we will be recording this session and making it available. If you had other folks in your organization or other folks trying to join that could not, we will make it available after making the presentation recording accessible. So probably next week, early next week. You can type questions into the Q&A pane at any time during the session. We'll try to get to them at the end, provided if we have time. Regardless, we will take your questions, disseminate them, and use them to help us compile an FAQ that we will then post on our website as well. So if you have good questions or if you just have anything in particular throughout the session, please type that in and we'll try to get to it. Okay, today the agenda, I'm going to talk about the background and overview of the program a little bit, what the scope of what we are assessing is, the various certification levels that can be achieved, other risk and authorization management programs and how those kind of align with TxRAMP. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the assessment process and content, continuous monitoring responsibilities if once certification is awarded, some additional information regarding the administration of the program, and then if we have time at the end, we will be addressing some questions and answers that are prompted through this session today. So starting with the overview, this has kind of been the steps that we've taken over the last several months and weeks to get where we currently are. We have some tight timelines that are in place based off of the legislation and the statute. Oh, can everyone hear me? Looks like some people are having.
We can hear you now.
Okay, that's strange. So if I missed anything, apologize on that. But these are the steps we've taken to get where we are currently since Senate Bill 475 in the 87th legislative session charged DIR with standing up this Texas Risk and Authorization Management Program. Beginning with some information gathering, so trying to identify the cloud services that are in use for the organizations that are subject to the program, looking at the other RAMP structures and the requirements, and then developing the rule as well as the program manual, which further defines some granular aspects of the program. Communication and outreach is still going on. Obviously, this is more of the widespread communication piece, but we will be continually providing information and updates as the program matures through various channels such as our mailing list and our website. And then the tool development. So we are creating a new solution within our existing tool sets to collect the information for these assessments and keep track of the various cloud services that are being assessed as well as those that have been assessed. So that should be launching in the very near future to where we can actually start conducting the assessments and certifying the cloud services. So as I just mentioned, currently finalizing the questionnaires that we will then be able to deploy and launch to the vendor contacts to collect the information needed to review for certification. We will also be having a webinar specific to Spectrum and the training related to that. It's probably more intended for our state agencies and institution organizations, but there will be a component related to the vendor portal webinar or vendor portal questionnaire that we will also be providing guidance for in the future. So what is the Texas Risk and Authorization Management Program? Essentially, it is a framework for collecting information about the security posture of a given cloud service provider and the cloud service product itself, and then assessing that in a standardized manner to make a determination on whether or not we can certify that product. And then after the certification, the organizations that are subject to the program requirements can then enter into contracts for that cloud service with the vendors. So this applies to all contracts that are entered into or renewed on or after January 1st of 2022 that store, process, or transmit agency-controlled data. And the organizations that this applies to is very important here. The state agencies, public institutions of higher education, and public community colleges, which equates to approximately 230 different organizations, are those that need to abide by the requirements of TxRAMP. So if you are a vendor and you only do business in the local government sector, or if you're only in K through 12, those organizations do not have to require a TxRAMP certification to enter into a contract for the cloud services. However, if you're a state agency or higher ed in the state of Texas, then they will require a appropriate TxRAMP certification prior to being able to enter into a contract for your services. There are a few caveats and conditions, which I'll get to in a moment as well, that scope out certain services based on the characteristics. But largely, if you're doing business with these types of entities, then this will likely apply to you if you want to continue doing business with them in the future. So how did this program come about from a structural standpoint? Senate Bill 475 from the 87th regular legislative session created section 2054.0593 of Texas Government Code, and that's really the highest level and broadest charges relating to this program. Charges DIR with standing up this program and creating a rule around it, which we have done. That rule, I believe, was published to the Secretary of State website and live yesterday. In the rule, it's a little bit more granular than statute, but it's still a bit vague. So we define the high-level responsibilities of DIR, the agencies, the different certification levels within there, and reference the program manual document, which I would highly recommend anybody that is interested in going through this certification process review. So the program manual is what is more of the governing document, so to speak, regarding how this program operates. And then within the program manual, we also have the control baselines for each of the levels that list the NIST 853 Rev 4 controls that will be assessed through this process. So that's the structure from broadest to most granular. And then again, we will be providing additional guidance and documentation to streamline these processes as the program matures. We are all under tight deadlines here and want to get this up and running as fast as possible so that we can meet our obligations. So if you go to this site, this webpage, this is where most of the communications will be handled and posted. The program manual is currently posted on there, as well as the control baselines. We may need to make some minor adjustments to the control baselines, but substantially going to remain the same. Just need to make a few clarifications within there. So I encourage you to go there, download and review these documents. It will help inform you quite a bit. And you can also continually check this for updates, as this will be a central location where we provide resources. Okay, so what is the scope actually here? We are going to be assessing and certifying cloud services in particular. So we are leveraging the definition of cloud computing from the NIST Special Publication 800-145, which you can see on the screen here. This is more for agencies in them to make the determination on whether or not a given service is applicable or if it actually meets the definition of cloud. But just for your awareness, this is the definition that we are using to most broadly scope what is in scope for being assessed. And then we also have some out of scope categories and characteristics. And again, it's the contracting agency or institution that would ultimately make the determination on whether or not your service fits into the out of scope or in scope categories. But if you're interested in getting certified and you do fall into these out of scope categories and characteristics, you may still undergo an assessment and ultimately become certified if the requirements are met. It's not part of the requirements that the services that fall into these categories would need a certification for an agency to enter into a contract. Now, consumption-focused services, so if you're not creating, storing, transmitting agency data, but you provide information through a cloud mechanism to an agency, that would fall out of scope. Graphic design, illustration services, social media, survey. A lot of the productivity type tools, I guess, would fall into here. LMS and training, that one is more focused on like a training platform where you consume videos, not necessarily things like Canvas or those other LMS that are really cloud-based and contain data. So, and then low impact software as a service, which I have a slide on in just a moment as well. We leverage some of the definitions from FedRAMP in this regard, except in this case, we are scoping the low impact software as a service out. And the whole purpose behind creating these out of scope characteristics is for us to focus on the cloud services that possess the most inherent risk. And I will get into that in a moment, as it's defined by the confidentiality requirements, as well as the business impact that could potentially have negative or adverse effects on an organization. Now, all these categories do have two caveats related to them. In these caveats, if violated, would put the service into scope. So that's if they create, process, or store confidential state-controlled data, except as needed to log in, given an email, password, maybe first name, last name, anything that's really high level and just used for authentication purposes. And then the second caveat being if they connect to a state system that does process, store, transmit state-controlled data, confidential data, that could impact the security posture of that system. So if it's integrated with another system, it would be subject to undergoing the assessment. Okay, so low impact SaaS, as I mentioned, we have certain criteria that need to be met in order for a cloud service to fall under the definition of low impact SaaS and thus be scoped out from the assessment and certification process. That is, first and foremost, meeting the definition of SaaS as described in that publication I mentioned earlier, not containing any personally identifiable information except as needed to log in, does not process, store, or transmit confidential information. It's a low impact information resource, which is defined in Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 202. And it operates on an existing infrastructure or platform as a service that has been certified under the program already. So if you are a SaaS provider and you meet these criteria, then you will not be subject to it unless the agency makes that determination. So that's a point I need to highlight a bit more. Agencies are the ones that will determine a lot of whether or not they believe that your product is in scope or out of scope. A low impact information resource is going to be defined by the agency, and I'll get into that in just a moment. So certification levels. At the highest level here, we have two certification levels. That's TxRAMP level 1 and TxRAMP level 2. And those align to the low baseline from NIST and the moderate baseline from NIST. Level 1 is for non-confidential data, largely public data, or low impact information resources, which is determined by the contracting agency. Level 2 is for cloud services that process, store, or transmit confidential information and are moderate or high impact information resources as determined by the contracting agency. So if you are not contracting with an agency and you are just seeking a certification for your product without having an active contract or undergoing or bidding on an active procurement, you may still request an assessment and dictate or determine the level that you want to be assessed and certified under without regard to the agency's determination of the impact. So if you're just coming in and you're looking to get certified under this for potential business with state of Texas entities, you can make that determination when you request the assessment. However, we will prioritize the cloud services that currently have contracts with the agencies subject to this program, as well as those that are bidding on open procurements currently. So that's just a thing to note. It could be a little bit down the road before the assessment is actually conducted if you're going through the process without an agency sponsor or without a contract currently in place. And then we have an additional certification level, which is called TxRAMP Provisional Certification. And this is agnostic to the levels that I mentioned earlier. It can be leveraged to continue to contract and do business with state entities for 18 months once granted, while the cloud service undergoes an assessment for level 1 or level 2. So the level 1, level 2 is a very standardized approach, which we are charged with standing up. TxRAMP Provisional, we wanted to leverage existing assessments and existing external assessments and audits to bridge the gap and manage the volume of assessments that will be coming through in a manner that gives us a level of assurance that there has been some objective review of the security posture of the cloud service. So I'll get into what types of artifacts and assessments can be accepted for review to ultimately grant that provisional status in just a bit. But just to know, given the timelines that we have in place, the provisional status will serve a very important role in ensuring that minimal business disruption occurs while this program is being implemented. So the information resources designation, going back to how you determine or how an agency determines what the minimum certification level needs to be for a given cloud service, these are the definitions for the low, moderate, and high impact information resources. So if your cloud service only processes the low impact information resources on the far left here, then at a minimum, you would require a TxRAMP level 1 certification to do business. And then if it's moderate or high impact and it processes, stores, or transmits confidential information, then that would require a minimum of level 2 certification. So you'll need to work with your agencies that you're contracted for the service to help determine what levels or what minimum level needs to be assessed and certified for a given product. Who determines the required certification level? I've mentioned this a few times. It's the contracting agency. In the cases where they are leveraging or have a current contract in place or have a potential future contract in place. And that's based on the confidentiality requirements and what they determine the impact of the information resources or cloud service is. Again, if a provider is seeking certification without any contracting agency involvement, which I call vendor initiated request for assessment, you can determine that level through the vendor request form, which I will also explain shortly. If there's a conflict between, if you do business with multiple agencies and one agency determines that cloud service is low impact information resources and another agency determines it's moderate and it has confidential information, in those cases, the provider should really make the determination on what level they should seek for certification. And typically you'll want to go to the higher level if you can meet those requirements so that you can do business with as many entities as possible in a manner that is secure. However, you need to ensure that you meet the requirements before you can actually get certified under that level 2. Services certified at TxRAMP level 1 may also request a TxRAMP level 2 certification or assessment as circumstances necessitate. So if you have a current contract in place that only requires a level 1 certification, and then you obtain a new customer and they actually require a level 2, then we can launch additional assessment components that you will complete, and then we can make a determination on if we can upgrade your certification, so to speak, to level 2. So you're not stuck for a given time period at level 1. You can advance to level 2 given the circumstances as they dictate. So what are the timelines here? For cloud services that level 2 require a level 2 certification, those need to be certified by January 1st of 2022 to enter or renew into contracts. This is in line with the statutory language of establishing the program and ensuring that these products and services are certified appropriately. The provisional certification that I mentioned will be a very important tool here to ensure that everybody remains in compliance as we are approaching January 1st, 2022 very quickly. So if you are a cloud provider and you're processing confidential information and a moderate or high impact information resources, I would seek a provisional certification sooner rather than later. And then we can also begin the assessment process to get fully certified under level 2 as soon as the tool is moved into the production environment. Level 1 certification, we are requiring by January 1, 2023 to enter or renew contracts. And this is going to help us prioritize the assessment and the workload to make sure that we're addressing the higher risk items up front. This is not to say that we won't be assessing and certifying level 1 cloud services throughout this entire time as well. It's just we are going to prioritize the level 2 due to the requirements related to when these certifications need to be in place to enter or renew contracts. And then cloud services that are granted a provisional certification will need to obtain the TxRAMP certification or equivalent, which I will also get to shortly, within 18 months from the date of the provisional certification is granted, which should give us and the cloud provider and the agencies enough time to undergo and fully and accurately assess the service to determine if the certification under level 1 or level 2 can be granted. So existing contracts for cloud services do not need to have that certification in place until the contract is renewed or a new contract is executed. So there's a partial grandfathering in. However, it is a good idea to get in the assessment queue as soon as possible. That way there is less of a risk that there's a lapse where you cannot continue to provide the services going forward. So keeping that in mind, if you have a contract that's set to expire in 2024 or something along those lines, then you technically would not need a certification until that contract is either renewed or there is a new procurement for that service that you're bidding on. And you'll need to work with the agency organizations to determine whether or not a certification is needed given the contracting activities that take place throughout the life. So accepted documentation evidence for provisional status. There are two ways to obtain this provisional status. The first one is more agency focused, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that, but an agency may sponsor a cloud service for provisional certification through a notification to DIR that they had conducted a risk assessment on the cloud service using whatever criteria they used, and provide the last date that the assessment occurred. And they largely say to us, we have reviewed this and deemed it acceptable for moderate impact information resources. And the DIR will review that notification of the sponsor request and make a determination on if we can grant a provisional certification. And then the second way to achieve the provisional certification applies more to the vendor side of things, which is a third-party review request. So if you have had an objective third-party review, audit, assessment performed on your cloud service, you may submit artifacts and documentation from that third-party assessment to DIR, and we will review that documentation and determine whether or not a provisional status can be granted based upon the artifacts provided. So very common artifacts in this realm would be things like a SOC 2 Type 2 report, evidence of ISO 27000 series certification, regulatory audits, PCI standards, CSA star, high trust, et cetera. So the list goes on and on. We are not limiting to a specific amount. If it's Arizona ramp authorized, that would also be acceptable in this case. We will accept these as documentation as part of the request, review it, and make that determination. So the provisional status application, so to speak, is a faster process than the overall assessment. So if you have had your cloud service undergo some assessment similar to these from a third party, then you can enter that information directly into the form, or you can provide the, fill out the form, which I'll speak about again. And then we will launch an assessment to collect that information. So there's two ways to go about that, and I'll get in more detail shortly. So a lot of questions come up regarding TxRAMP, StateRAMP, and FedRAMP, and how they're different, how they're similar. Within rule, we explicitly stated that we will accept a StateRAMP status and FedRAMP status that are appropriate and certify those products directly under TxRAMP without having that cloud service undergo an assessment certification. So we all based off the same criteria. Just mentioned, we will certify this without having to undergo a TxRAMP assessment because these are actually a bit more stringent than the criteria that we have developed, and they undergo a third-party assessment through the approved third-party assessment organizations. So we have determined that these appropriate statuses, I'll get to that in a second, are appropriate for our purposes, and we'll certify those. So FedRAMP Marketplace and StateRAMP Authorized Vendors List is where we will get the determinations on whether or not a product can be certified through these mechanisms, and those are listed here for reference. And then a comparison across all three. All three are based on NIST 853 revision 4. All three, or at least StateRAMP and FedRAMP have mentioned that they are moving to Rev 5 in the future. We plan to also move to Rev 5 in the future, but at this time, it makes more sense to base it off Rev 4. We are also undergoing an update of our security control catalog, which will be aligning with Rev 5. That has not been approved yet, so we needed to go with what was existing, which is based off of Rev 4. So in the future, we will be moving to that, and I believe all organizations really are moving to that. It's just going to take a matter of time, but just so you know, this is based off of the Rev 4 requirements. StateRAMP and FedRAMP require a third-party assessment organization to perform an assessment on the service. DIR is going to perform the assessment in-house. There's no cost related to TxRAMP certification because we are not contracting with the 3 PAOs, and we are handling essentially the 3 PAO duties and PMO duties within our agency. And then StateRAMP and FedRAMP have costs associated with it. I'm not sure of what the amounts are exactly, but there is some cost related to it. Impact level determined by TAC 202, I already mentioned that. For TxRAMP, for StateRAMP, they have a classification tool that asks about the type of data that is leveraged within the cloud service. And then FedRAMP is determined by the FIPS 199 information types and the baselines for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Continuous monitoring. Under StateRAMP and FedRAMP, well, under FedRAMP, continuous monitoring information is made available to federal agencies. Under StateRAMP, the continuous monitoring information is made available to the public sector members, state and local governments that are members of StateRAMP and have sponsored that given cloud service. And then for TxRAMP, the continuous monitoring information will be provided to the agencies that are contracting for the cloud services. TxRAMP is mandatory for state agencies. StateRAMP is a 501c6. It's not mandatory. It's meant to encourage information sharing and provide a similar function to FedRAMP at the state and local level across various states. And then FedRAMP obviously must do business with the federal government. TxRAMP does not require that you have a current contract or are doing business with the state of Texas. If you seek a certification, you may do that without having current contract in place. So those are some of the differences. This could probably be a webinar in and of itself to go through all of them, but that is at a high level what the differences are between TxRAMP, StateRAMP, and FedRAMP. So if you're a vendor and you're providing services to multiple states, StateRAMP might be something that you're interested in pursuing, as we will accept that for the TxRAMP assessment, but other states are also looking more towards StateRAMP as a kind of standard and assurance that the service is in a place that is secure enough for their purposes. If you're only doing business in Texas, you can choose to go StateRAMP route, or if you wanted to go directly through TxRAMP, those are kind of your options that you have relating to it. So how do the categories align across here, the certification levels? They are aligned very well across all three. The level 1 certification corresponds to the low baseline from FedRAMP. StateRAMP has category 1 and 1+, which has a few additional security controls. And then level 2 aligns with the moderate for FedRAMP and category 3 for StateRAMP. We do not have a high baseline in TxRAMP. StateRAMP does not have a high that I'm aware of currently. They might be working on that, but I'm not sure. So if a given service or if an agency requires a high, FedRAMP high, they will go through FedRAMP, but our maximum level is a level 2. So it needs to meet those standards, but agencies may add additional control requirements or security requirements into their specific contracts that state that you need to meet additional requirements beyond what TxRAMP certification level 2 requires. So we will accept the verified offerings from StateRAMP and FedRAMP at the appropriate level for TxRAMP. And that's for StateRAMP, ready, authorized, and provisional. And for FedRAMP, that's ready, provisional, authority to operate, and authority to operate, aka authorized. These are the statuses that mean that they have undergone a third-party assessment in StateRAMP and FedRAMP, which is why we can accept them. Those that are in process, we will not accept until they achieve that verified offering. as you see there. That's what the progressing offerings mean. They're undergoing an assessment, so to speak. All right, so talk about the assessment piece here. Assessment initiation, specifically for the vendor community, vendors may initiate a request for assessment without the agency sponsorship by completing this form. It's an external form that you should have access to, where you provide contact information about cloud service that you want as the target of the assessment, and then some additional details around the cloud service and the existing status of procurements and contracts with these agencies. We will take that information and import it into StateRAMP portal, and then agencies may elect to sponsor a request for assessment, which will increase our prioritization or focus on it, because that means there is an agency need or demand to have that service assessed. So they will have access to an inventory of the services that have been requested to have an assessment conducted on them, and they will be able to essentially upvote it into a posture where we will then prioritize it based upon the demand from the agencies. The form itself, what is actually needed on there, again, you can go to the link there. It's in the program manual as well. Contact information, we need a good contact that we can reach out to and make sure that they understand what is being asked of them through the assessment process. The actual cloud service name, description, the manufacturer, et cetera, that will be assessed. Procurement information, the level of assessment that is being requested, and then the number of agencies that are leveraging the services. Prioritization. So obviously there are a lot of cloud services in use, and we need to prioritize these effectively to minimize business disruption and treat them in a fair manner. So we are going to be looking at several factors to make these determinations. We will be allocating as many resources as possible to get this done expeditiously and efficiently. But in some cases, there may be certain delays based upon how many assessments are coming in and what is going on. So the level of certification requested, obviously we need to assess those that are requesting a level 2 certification based upon when the certification requirements go into effect. Existing authorizations or certifications, some are easier to process and faster to process, such as having StateRAMP or FedRAMP. Those will be the first ones that we will certify under the program, as it takes no additional action other than populating the information. State agency, describe priority or justification. So if the agency defines a request as absolutely critical or a very high priority for them, then that's something we'll take into consideration whenever we prioritize these. And then the planned procurement activities and existing ones. So if you have a contract that is going up for renewal on January 1st, that would be prioritized higher than one coming up for renewal on February 1st, just an example. So the assessment itself is kind of two parts. We have a controls assessment where the vendor goes through and determines how given controls are being satisfied. And then there's a documentation review as well. So under level 1, we're focusing on approximately 124 different controls from NIST 853 Rev 4. You can see the breakdown here. And then under level 2, we're going to be examining 325 controls to determine the eligibility for certification. So if you are familiar with NIST 853 Rev 4, then you will be in good shape. We are currently populating the questionnaires that will be sent out, and that is the mechanism by which the vendor will determine or respond to the controls and provide evidence relating to the controls so that it may be assessed and reviewed. We are leveraging the vendor portal component from StateRAMP to do so, to collect the information. This is just a screenshot of an example of what this looks like. Within here, the target organization or the organization that is filling out the questionnaire can assign or delegate certain questions or sections or the entire questionnaire to other members of their organization, provided they have the same email domain. And then they will also have access to the questionnaire and they can fill out that section. It will be pretty straightforward from a user standpoint, and you can track your progress over time. And then once all of the questions are completed and documentation is uploaded, you'll be able to submit the assessment, and that data will be piped back into the portal. Then a DIR can review that information. So the questionnaires, when they're launched, as I mentioned, can be assigned to other delegates, and you can do that at the question section or questionnaire level, provided the same email domain as the original target recipient of the assessment exists. So if you have multiple domains or different domains and you need to assign that to a given person, we'll either need to relaunch the assessment itself and target it at that appropriate domain, or the person or persons that were initially targeted as the assessment will need to coordinate the responses with the other folks that are outside of their organization or do not have that same domain. This one is a bit more technical, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Whenever you go to request the assessment, we ask for contact information. So that information or email address should be that of the person that would likely be the person filling out the questionnaire itself. Some general tips for the assessment itself. Obviously, responses should be truthful, accurate, and reflect the current state, not the future state of the security posture. Answering no to a question doesn't mean you're automatically disqualified. We're looking for truthful information in this regard. If you support the capability, but it's a setting that's configurable by the end user customer, we're also taking that into consideration. That will be some of the response options for certain questions as well. You can leverage the open text fields, which are going to be included for each family to provide additional information for each of those sections. So if you need to provide a bit more context around a given answer to a question, then there's an opportunity to do so at given points in time throughout the assessment itself. Make sure that you keep your contact information up to date. If somebody leaves and they're kind of designated as our point of contact, then we don't want notifications and to delay any sorts of communications by trying to find the appropriate contact for your organization for clarification. So that might be something that you want to put a note down about, making sure that you have the appropriate contact and that you keep contact information up to date with us. And then documentation should fully address the applicable control requirements. I think that goes without saying, but that is one of the criteria that is going to be looked at in terms of scoring for the documentation review itself. And those requirements for documentation are really addressed in the control language themselves. If you look at -1, the policies and procedures controls, you can see there are certain things that are called out specifically that will need to be included as part of the documentation. So here's a list of the documentation that we're requiring as part of the assessment. It's the security policies and then some additional system security documentation, SSP, IR plan, a boundary diagram. StateRAMP has a template and template library for all of these documents, which I would encourage folks to use if they don't already have these documents developed. We will accept alternative or other forms of the documentation that go beyond the templates, but the templates can provide for faster processing due to that they are standardized. However, again, we will accept them provided that they are meeting the requirements that are specified in the controls appropriately. So just a note on that. Documentation. Here are some of the criteria that we will be looking at when we are scoring the documentation. So from a compliance standpoint, do the documents actually meet the requirements that are stated in the controls? How well are they formed? How complete are they, et cetera? When were they last updated? All those sorts of things that you would typically do in a documentation review. I keep this in here though, just so that folks can focus on making sure that the documents are up to a standard that will make things smooth through the review. This is just an example for one of the documents here, system security plan, the key components included in there, general information system info, categorization level of what's appropriate, key roles, cloud info, blah, blah. It's all what you would expect. The templates on there go through all of this in detail, along with the attachments that are to be included as part of the system security plan. This is also just some tips on crafting the policies and making sure your procedures are in place. We're not asking for procedures through our program. I believe StateRAMP and FedRAMP also require the procedures to be provided. We're just asking for policies for our purposes, but the policies need to address these components specifically. And then there are parameters associated with it that are organization defined on the General 853, but on the RAMP criteria, we are requiring a policy review or update at least every 3 years, and then procedures reviews should be updated at least annually. And then you should also identify within the policies who within your organization, whether personnel or roles, are to be disseminated and communicated. So shared responsibility model. Obviously, when talking about cloud, there are certain controls that are the responsibility of the cloud provider, the customer organization, and then potentially other cloud providers as well. And that has to do with the level of control as you move from the lower levels in the stack to the higher levels in the stack. Obviously, with on-prem, the customer organization is fully responsible for all layers throughout here. But as you move through infrastructure as a service, you're looking at the physical layer. The data center physical controls are typically handled by the infrastructure as a service provider, whereas the customer organization in that case focuses on the operating systems, the data layer, et cetera. And then as you move over to SaaS, those cases, there can be a SaaS provider that is leveraging another cloud provider, which is a common question that we get, and I will talk about here. And again, in some cases, the service configuration or how the product is actually configured could be up to the customer organization to ensure that they have implemented it appropriately to meet the control requirements, which we, again, will be taking into consideration as part of the questionnaire. And that is information I believe that is important to make known to the customer organizations so that they can appropriately address the controls from whatever responsibility they have. So leveraging these authorizations, in the event that a software as a service vendor is leveraging a infrastructure as a service vendor to provide their application, obviously the SaaS provider will inherit some controls from the infrastructure provider. We have this letter, or supplemental letter, that needs to be completed. It's just one page that states that the SaaS provider is leveraging a certified infrastructure or platform, and we will use it in accordance with best practices and with requirements of TxRAMP. And once that is completed, it will be uploaded as part of the assessment. So we need to identify if that is the case, and then we can inherit certain controls from the underlying infrastructure provider as part of the assessment and ensure that we are accurately reflecting who is responsible for providing certain controls through the assessment process. Now, the SaaS provider can also complete the assessment without undergoing the supplemental letter piece if they're not operating on the authorized or certified infrastructure or platform as a service, but we will need to obtain evidence relating to the controls being met at that level in the stack of things. So continuous monitoring. So when it's all said and done and you've been granted the certification, continuous monitoring requirements will go into effect. And our continuous monitoring reporting deviates more from the FedRAMP and StateRAMP requirements. For our level 1 certified cloud services, we're requiring an annual report of vulnerability information. And for level 2, we're requiring a quarterly report of vulnerability information. And we're not requesting the raw vulnerability scan results. If you see over on this table to the right, you can see the common vulnerability scoring system categories and what components are related to it and what information we'll be asking for as part of this vulnerability reporting. So for the low and medium, we're just asking for aggregate numbers of what was identified, what was remediated, and what's outstanding. And then for high and critical vulnerabilities, we're asking that same information, but also if there are any outstanding existing vulnerabilities, then what remediation plans are in place or compensating controls are in place to mitigate the risks associated with those vulnerabilities. So you can see it's kind of a much higher level in terms of reporting this information, and the frequency of reporting it is also less burdensome than the StateRAMP and FedRAMP requirements. So vulnerability reporting, that will be collected through the same mechanism, the vendor portal that the initial assessment will be performed on, and there will be automated notifications that contain links to complete the reports at given time periods throughout the certification length. And then a few other things to note regarding continuous monitoring reporting. Critical security issues and breach of confidential information, or PII. Those are defined in more detail in the program manual, as is significant changes, but those need to be reported to DIR within 48 hours of discovery or investigation, so that we may take the appropriate measures and keep track of that information. Significant changes need to be reported within 30 days, and significant changes refer to changes that are likely to affect the security posture of the cloud service itself. So if you change data centers, or if you implement a significant new feature, or let's say it's you lose a certification of StateRAMP or something like that, those need to be informed within 30 days of discovery of the change or plan change. So if you can be proactive about it, that will also help smooth things out in terms of if we need to reassess a given component based upon the change. That's detailed further in the program manual, so I encourage you to take a look at that. So as I mentioned, the reporting requirements will be sent to the identified point of contacts on a regular basis, and that will contain a link to the questionnaire to complete. The information will then be piped back into Spectrum and made available for the agencies that are contracting for the service to review, and that will help keep them informed. Now, again, the agencies may have additional requirements in their individual contracts for the service that go beyond the requirements that are specified here, but from a minimum standpoint of maintaining compliance, that is the continuous monitoring that has been established for TxRAMP purposes. So some additional information generally about administration. Certification revocation. Essentially, anytime you can deviate from compliance with the stated requirements of the program, that can result in a revocation of your status. So failure to meet continuous monitoring obligations, failure to maintain compliance with the controls that are required for a given baseline, anything like that could potentially result in a revocation. Obviously, this is not our first line of defense. We want to work with the providers to ensure that there can be remediation actions, or that they can get back on track to ensure that we don't have to revoke that certification. But failure to submit the continuous monitoring information, or failure to respond to concerns or inquiries, ultimately certifications can be revoked, and that's what I'm saying. So grievances and appeals. Agencies may report perceived failures to maintain compliance to DIR, and DIR will serve as kind of a coordinating entity between the vendor, if the vendor is non-responsive to the agency requests in regards to the certification status. So we want to work with the vendors, we want to work with the agencies to make sure that all parties are being satisfied, but in the event that a vendor has failed to maintain compliance or respond to the agency's needs in those cases, then DIR may take corrective action in the form of whether it's remediation action, remediation plan, or revocation actions. So providers may also appeal certification decisions. So if you were rejected from certification but feel like you had sufficient evidence, you may submit in writing to DIR that you feel that there needs to be a reconsideration for certification. Most of the time, however, we will work with the vendor to clarify the deficiencies that need to be corrected prior to granting the certification. So rather than just flat out rejecting it, we will respond to the vendor and say, we need additional information or clarification around controls XYZ or requirements XYZ to be able to fully certify you. And then you can come back and provide that information for a reconsideration. So typically, it will not be rejected unless there is a failure to maintain communication and work together towards obtaining that certified status. So Recertification. So the certifications for level 1 and 2 are valid for 3 years from the date it was granted, provided that obviously the cloud service maintains compliance with the program requirements. Recertification will be very similar to the certification process and include updating the information that was provided, the documentation, as necessary for us to perform the review. So this is down the road a little bit, but I wanted to put it out there just for planning purposes. The contacts that we have on file will be notified via automated emails at 12-month interval and 6-month interval prior to the date the certification ends to give sufficient time to initiate a new assessment or a recertification rather. And that should be sufficient to undergo the recertification component. So information sessions, today is the second one there. We did a information session with agencies on Tuesday. We will be posting a recording of both of these sessions to our website. We're going to post the agency one very shortly once we get those captions on there. And then this one should be posted early next week. And then we will be providing an overview of the Spectrum portal and training in the near future whenever we launch that into production. We just need to get the questions populated within the system, do some testing, and we are shooting to get that out as soon as possible. However, the request for assessment initiation form is available through the program manual and the links that I listed earlier. And then the contact email for everything relating to this is tx-ramp@dir.texas.gov. If you have additional questions, you can reach out to that. We've got a list of questions going in the background here that we will also be reviewing and incorporating into a FAQ that will be posted to our website.